Hi, welcome everyone to another episode of Let's Talk Special Economic Zones. I'm your host, Ainsley Brown. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the interaction between zones and the domestic territory. Now, zones, by their very nature, whatever you want to call them, and this is part of the challenge sometimes with zones. Do you want to call them special economic zones, free zones, export processing zones, enterprise zones? Uh, Whatever you want to call them, free trade zones, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. There are certain basics around that unify them. How they function is going to be a matter of policy within each country, or even um, within the same country. Two zones may work slightly different because they were designed from a policy perspective, legislative perspective, to function differently. And even when you have the same legislation, you may have, or you will have, I wouldn't say may, you will have differences in how a zone operates within that legislative structure. However, one unifying factor is that a zone is a specially designated, delineated area. It's separate and apart from the rest of the economy. Different rules apply. What those rules are is going to vary per the regime that you're dealing with. But one of the things is clear: there is a separation, right? And there is an interaction between the two. Now, back in the heyday, or back in the I guess the modern iteration, the first modern iteration in the 70s and so forth, and coming all the way up to the 90s and early 2000s, zones typically were full enclaves, meaning they were separate, and the objective, policy objective, was largely mass employment, not so much overall economic development. That paradigm change. Zones now are typically used for not just employment but also economic development. So they cluster in and attracting different entities to join. So then naturally there is an interaction. Now, also based on the WTO's uh, countervailing duties agreement, you cannot have export subsidies. So there has to be that interaction between the zone and the domestic territory. That is to say that the domestic territory can sell, and there's not that limitation, or ought not to be, because in some regimes there's still those limitations in terms of the limitations on domestic territory selling goods and providing services to the zones, and the zones providing goods and services to the domestic territory. Now, this can create issues of competition where people in the domestic territory complain that, oh, the ones in the zone are competing against us and are being subsidized, and there is some truth to that. However, this is why there are certain limitations put on the zones. No matter which regime you look at, there will be limitations. While goods and services can freely move back and forth, there are certain limitations so that you don't create that unfair competition for domestic players that may be doing the same thing. What you want is the linkages. That's what you want to encourage, that linkage back and forth. So the zone may be doing something that the domestic territory isn't doing. So you provide that better good or better service, and likewise providing that raw material and or value added service or value added good into as an input into production into the zones. So that is that interaction. There's that give and take, but there is always going to be that line between the two. And also, there's going to be limitations placed upon the zones. What those limitations are, how that looks, is going to vary per the regime, right? So, for example, a good example is particularly these days with the OECD and its base erosion initiative, is ensuring that there are substance requirements within the zones, meaning that they're actually employing people from the country, not just outsourcing anywhere and just using the country as a means to benefit from tax incentives, but they're actually investing in the country, employing in the country, um, and so forth. So there are certain limitations that would be placed on, and of course, the country would benefit from that, right? So if you like this episode, please like, share, comment if you want to see down below, and if you want to see a future episode or have ideas for a future episode, just leave a comment down below, and I'll get right back to you.